My name is Jonathan Morris, and whereas I think most of you are really historians or in some way engaged with studying the First World War, I'm actually a global historian of coffee. I've just finished writing a book which is a global history of coffee. I'm saying this to start with because, apart from the fact I'd love you to go and buy this global history of coffee when it comes out, and I'd be happy to give you a discount, etc., etc., because actually, how much do I know about coffee in the First World War? Well, probably a lot less than all of you. But can I produce, at the end of it, some coffee from the First World War? Well, not quite from, but I think I can get you fairly close to what it's going to taste like. Okay, so the starting point for thinking about this was that Sarah had shown me the Buchler exhibit, and we were talking about things we could do with it, and one thing that really jumped out is the food. And for me, of course, one thing that jumps out is whenever I see people drinking coffee. And coffee and war are quite an interesting combination in many ways. A lot of innovations take place in the coffee world through war. And not only innovation, but the other thing that takes place is a lot of people learn to drink coffee who didn't know about drinking coffee before. Now, there's quite a lot in what I've just said that in reality isn't quite as true as it sounds. A lot of people learn to drink something that they believe to be coffee that they have never drunk before. Quite a few innovations take place but often get discarded and then reappear later in a much more perfected format. So there's quite a lot going on, but what I want to do is do two things. One is to try and answer a question which came to me a while ago, and the other is to give you some sense of how coffee changes. The geopolitics of coffee are changed by the war, and that changes the way that we experience coffee and the taste that we get. And I'm going to do it very quickly with a set of pictures, starting with this one, which is in the exhibit. And here we have, obviously, the coffee being given to soldiers as they're wounded soldiers coming back from the front. Coffee and war, as I said, go together. And I think there are some reasons for that. And the main ones, I suppose, are that we think of coffee as being warm, so it can transform a meal. And in this way, it's the same really as tea in the sense of transforming a cold meal into a warm one. That we think of coffee as comforting, and that's really what's going on here, and you'll see quite a lot of the images. The idea of coffee as a sort of a comforting thing that we come to, gives us that warm feeling. But of course there's one further thing. Coffee, as we know, has an active ingredient. It makes us more active, it raises our metabolisms, and it keeps us supposedly alert for longer. And if you're fighting a war, and if you're the generals fighting a war, as well as if you're the actual people in the trench, one of the things you want to do is keep your troops as alert and as happy for as long as possible. Now, the First World War is not the first war in which people have realised that. The war that transforms coffee is the American Civil War. And there's an important thing to say about that. The side with the coffee won. So, the North, if you like, the Union, had access to coffee, brewed coffee virtually all the time. If you read the soldiers' diaries, they talk more about coffee than they do about their rifles. They talk more about coffee than they do bullets. Literally, if you do a word count, coffee is greater than those two things. It's a really striking statistic. The First World War, in a sense, is the first time we see that begin to transfer to Europe. So, here is the question I have, because saying this to an audience of Brits seems quite incredible. Incredible that I'm telling you that coffee in the First World War changed everything, and incredible also because the last one of these events I came to, which is the event Business as Usual, the lady in the corner there, it's Susan or Helen George, gave a great presentation about retail sites, and particularly in Watford, and showed this advert. And as you see, it's urging people in Britain to drink coffee for breakfast, and this is December 1917. Now, why on earth would you be trying to urge Brits to drink coffee for breakfast?
Release tea for the troops.
Well, you might want to release tea for the troops, but actually, I'm going to try and solve this question over the period. because actually it's also true that in some of the propaganda it's like, you should now drink coffee because this will make it easier for us to provision with tea. But I don't, in honesty, think, and I'm checking to see if Rachel is here so that she could correct me, but I can't see her, so I suppose I can just make it up. I don't actually think that that's the real reason, but I want to think about that question. So here is my answer. Where have they got an awful lot of coffee? Brazil. We all know the songs, yeah? Now, Brazil, and this is where we get into the geopolitics of the thing, Brazil already by the First World War, by the outbreak of the First World War, is the world's biggest coffee producer by a country mile. I would say probably it's producing on average 60-70% of the world's coffee by that point. Just to make it clear, most of that coffee is also going to America, but a substantial portion of it, of course, goes to Europe. Now, shipping coffee to Europe becomes obviously hazardous, and it's hazardous in several ways. Brazil is neutral during the beginning of the war, from 1914 through to 1917. It's a neutral country, and it attempts to abide by the laws of how you are supposed to neutrally ship your produce. But of course we have submarine warfare going on, we have the Allied blockade going on. It's quite difficult for coffee to get through, and of course there isn't that much sense of coffee as being a priority at this point. So for all of those reasons, Brazil is extremely worried by the outbreak of the war. And in fact what happens in the first 2 years is to make that worry even greater. Demand goes down, European shipments are dislocated. The result, therefore, is a huge amount of coffee in Brazil and not enough coffee going out of Brazil, so you have a glut of coffee, so you have a collapsing price. So the coffee price is going down, and when your number one export is coffee, which it was for Brazil, that's a real problem. So when we get to 1917, as we know, usually we all think of this as the point that America entered the war, but so did Brazil. And these two things are again not unconnected in several ways. First of all, there's an incident after the resumption by the Germans of unlimited submarine warfare, when this steamship Parana is a coffee producing area in Brazil, carrying coffee, was actually torpedoed and sunk. And so this becomes the casus belli, ultimately, for Brazil to declare war. But I would suggest that the real reason is actually rather different, which is that the Brazilians need to make sure that they stay in touch with the people who drink their coffee, the Americans. Here we've got American servicemen in New York in 1918 drinking coffee. By far the biggest market for coffee in the world, one with which at the beginning of the war Brazil supplied 75%. By the end of the war, and by halfway through the war, in fact, they don't. And there's another reason for that, and I want to look at the next biggest coffee drinking country at that time. Oh, no, I don't. I want to say something about this. No, I'm going to go on and go back to that. I'm going to talk about Germany. Did you know Germany grew coffee? Probably not. Did you know Germans grew coffee? Germans grew a lot of coffee. German origin people grew huge amounts of coffee in Latin America. Particularly, this is Guatemala, where they absolutely dominated the trade, and most Guatemalan coffee ended up in Germany before World War I. A large number of Germans were also involved in the coffee trade in Brazil. So, for example, the biggest single coffee farm owner in Brazil was of German heritage, a man called Francisco Schmidt. And in fact, the president of Brazil during the first years of the war was also of German ancestry. Okay, in the disruption of the war, it's no longer possible to ship from Guatemala to Germany. So the Guatemalans have to find somewhere else for their coffee. That coffee ends up going to America. That's reproduced in much of Central America. Costa Rica used to ship primarily actually to Britain, presumably mostly for re-export. That begins to go to America. So suddenly Central America starts also supplying the United States. Brazil's portion of coffee, the total coffee market in the US, goes down to 50%. So Brazil needs somehow to make sure that it's going to stabilize its market and its price. And by going into the First World War, it creates a lever by which it can basically go to America and say, we need price stability and we are your allies. And indeed, a price stabilization scheme is brought in 1917 to stabilize the world price of coffee. So the kind of answer, and I think that to go back to our Brit point, that's almost a follow-on from that. Because there's something interesting. I showed you the advert for, should drink more coffee. Beginning of 1917, it was that Britain had banned any shipments of coffee being made from Brazil to Britain because coffee wasn't a priority good, and why would we invest money and men in defending coffee? So it's a complete reversal, and I would suggest it really actually is about who's allied with who, the geopolitics of coffee. Let's talk a little bit about drinking coffee and who is drinking it. Okay, so the Germans, and I'm going to ask Margriet for some comments on this. This is a photo which appears in the Getty Library and is supposedly of a thing called a coffee klatsch, so it's a kind of an afternoon coffee gathering of women in the 1900s. And I looked at it the first time, I thought, oh, that's fantastic, I'm going to stick in my book as an illustration of coffee klatsch. And I'm now looking at it and thinking, do you know what? No, that is an illustration on a stage of people staging a coffee klatsch. Yeah? However, what that tells you is just how rooted in the culture it was. Yeah? So we have Germany as the main drinking centre in Europe. Hamburg is by far the main coffee importing centre in Europe. And of course, therefore, when the Allied blockade sets in, this trade is very much disturbed. Which means that we have to go looking for some alternatives. Now, interestingly enough, what do Brits know about coffee? I'm hoping that I've got the slides in the order I think. Yes, I have. Okay, this is what we know about coffee, yeah, at this time and probably for some time to come. The camp coffee, which is a kind of a coffee essence produced in Glasgow, actually. Hannah's there, so by the firm called Patterson's. So you might think, actually, First World War would be a great time for camp coffee. But on the other hand, Patterson's, in fact, when I look at their archives, were absolutely terrified. Well, what they were terrified of was not losing access to coffee supplies. They were terrified of losing access to that, chicory supplies. Okay? Because chicory is the root vegetable that you can roast to create a surrogate of coffee. Now, camp coffee, you'll see, is indeed labelled coffee with chicory. It's actually an essence of coffee with chicory. The chicory is grown primarily in Central Europe, and particularly in Germany. Now, one of, therefore, the oddities of the war is that the Germans began to keep their chicory, to turn to coffee, and so the actual impact on Britain, strangely enough, would be, if anything, that we might have had to drink some more real coffee if we drank any coffee, because we didn't have as much access to chicory. What does it taste like? Well, funnily enough, we can find out. Because what we have managed to do is I worked with a local roaster. I say I worked with, I mean he did, for me, a mixture of coffee and chicory. And we have mixed it in the way that you would have experienced it in World War I. That is to say, we've mixed chicory, roasted chicory, with the worst kind, the lowest, cheapest value of kind of coffee that you can get, because that's what we use it for. It's a very economical type of drink. To say a very little bit about it, and I have still to taste it, so I can see that the lady is looking at me thinking, oh my God, when's he going to go and taste it? What do? We roast it as high as we can, because with luck, you're going to taste the roast and not taste the coffee. In other words, you're going to taste the caramelization and the sugar, not the actual fact that it's pretty foul. However, I rather suspect you're going to find out that it is. So, we're going to have in a minute or two our afternoon tea tasting. And Julie is going to tell us what we're going to eat with that tasting. I just want to draw your attention to one thing. We are going to go and look at the Buchler exhibit, and that's where we'll have our tea. We have highlighted out here pictures which relate to food in the exhibit in various sections. You'll see some of the things that we've been talking about and have been eating today crop up. You'll see a large number of rabbits. Poor them. You'll see quite a large number of vegetables. You'll see a lot of scenes of the ways in which life in this provincial town of Braunschweig was restructured a little bit by the war. And I know Marguerite has told you about the differences between that experience and the experience in big cities like, I guess Berlin was where Kollwitz was, yeah? So we want you to experience this and get a sense of it. We also, you can see Chris at the back there. Chris is going to be there once we've fed him his coffee. And he will be there, and we would like those of you, if you see an image and you really like an image that you particularly associate with, one of the things we're doing in the project is filming people with a picture that they like, saying a little bit about why they like it. And we'll help you because we have a few questions and it only lasts a couple of minutes. So if you see a picture you really like, you'd like to be filmed, we'd love to do that with you. But what we want to do first of all is give you some afternoon tea. There is some tea, by the way, and you can try and see how you get on with a chicory coffee. Thanks very much.